Thank you very much. As you can see here, the title of my presentation has changed slightly along the way. This has been rather characteristic of my presentation, of my project, but at last finally got a good topic, I've got a thesis, and I'm very ready to go with it. So we'll be presenting today on a sung reading, so an operatic approach to P. Craig Russell's The Ring of the Nibelung. So not working with the Roy Thomas version at this point. I want to say thank you to Tim Meagher and the College of Arts and Sciences, to my advisor, Dr. Richard Keegan, my German advisor, Dr. Bartels, Dr. Zacharias for helping me with the narrative theory section, Dr. Bakewell, who was very much a kind of a preparatory mentor, getting me before I went to Germany, and then also my boss over at the Opera House in Germany, Lord Lenz. Starting off with, comic studies are a rapidly expanding field in current scholarship. Much attention has been paid particularly to graphic novels as an extended story in the comics form geared toward an older audience. Recently, a comic scholar named Jared Gardner has raised the following suggestion for new developments in comic studies. And so I quote here, I would suggest that a narrative theory of the comics form requires a turn to orality and performance studies as much as it does a turn to more obvious traditions of art theory. And so I found this a point of particular interest with my major in English, but also minors in music and German. This became kind of a focal point or a channel for many different academic passions and interests. So I'll kind of develop them in one fell swoop, hopefully. So, following the trajectory that Gardner has indicated, I'm working to develop a performance approach to the narrative theory of graphic novels by exploring the way first that an opera tells a story, and then by applying that by analogy to the way that a graphic novel tells a story. My focal point will be the award-winning graphic novel The Ring of the Nibelung by P. Craig Russell, who is now, as of yesterday, my friend on Facebook. Published by Dark Horse between 2000 and 2002, and based off the operas of German romantic composer Richard Wagner. I have a pretty extensive theoretical foundation support. I draw largely from narrative theory, and then from that particularly to the reading drama school. But as I was going through my presentation, I figured it'd be a lot more fun just to look at the pictures. So I will focus mostly then on the actual panel work itself, and then draw my analysis on the panel. So there we go. Is it okay if I take this? Okay. So again, Ring of the Nibelung, Germanic mythology, par excellence. So. Here, this is the first scene, the first point I'd like to make is the imaginary space through verbal or visual language. So, the point I'm making here at this one is that graphic novel and opera are both representational media utilizing visual and verbal channels and signs drawn from common human experience, such as the body, architectural space, properties, and lighting. So, in the case of both graphic novels and opera, the story is not actually occurring whether on the stage or the page. Both are utilizing a certain sign system in order to present the story to the reader's imagination. So both actually use a very similar sign system in terms of the human body, human form, architectural space, lighting. And so actually this scene, in terms of P. Craig Russell's work, actually probably works the best as one of a specifically theatrical representation of the work. So this is from the Valkyrie, so the second of the Ring operas. And this is the scene in which Siegfried enters the house of hunting. And so you can see here how this is employing then pretty clearly both a visual and verbal language in order to create the sense of the story. Also, obviously you can see here the entire scene kind of at one glance. I got the tree there at the center of the house. You can see the fireplace, the kind of the warmth coming from the fire. You can see outside it's dark and cold. You can see kind of right here, especially there's a sword in the shadows that's going to play a larger role later in the scene. Right now it's in the shadows, but later as Siegfried is enlightened, you'll actually kind of see the sword a bit more clearly. And so you can also read the nature of the inhabitant of the house as well. You can see here again, you have the horned helmet, you have the shield with the axe, the bear skins, the wolf skins. So this is obviously the house of someone who is very dangerous, possibly a hunter or warrior. So that is all kind of presented in that one single glance. And then obviously Siegfried himself, he's coming in from snow, cold, he is exhausted. and you can see his position, he's stooped, he's rather weary. And so his words also emphasize this on the verbal level as well as the visual. So in the speech level, so whoever owns this hearth, I must rest here. So his words establishing the space of the story by referring to the hearth, and also establishing as well his state of character as being utterly exhausted. And so this scene in particular is important because the rest of the scene that follows here will take place in this one space of the room. And so this becomes kind of a reference point, and like an imaginary stage then that the reader can hold in mind as the story progresses and kind of hold everything back then in relation to this first establishing sequence. So the next point then I'd like to argue is that both graphic novels and opera require active synthetic reading from the viewer. So they're both mimetic media that do not necessarily require a fixed narrator, which demands synthetic reading on the part of the reader or the viewer. So obviously, you have a prose novel or something. The narrative there is all in one voice. It's all synthesized for you. It's all there in one kind of single coherent narrative stream. Whether or not you can always trust the narrator is a whole other issue altogether, but you have at least that coherent narrative. So in the case of both graphic novels and opera, as we've seen before, they both use this mimetic sign system. And so the reader or the viewer needs to take in all these images going on at the same time, all this huge kind of sensory overload, and somehow make sense of that. So I here illustrate this from a scene from Siegfried, the third ring opera, in which Siegfried receives the shards of his father's sword and needs to forge them together then to create his own new sword. So what he does with that is he takes the old fragments and he files them down, then puts them in a crucible, melts them, and then from that melted or the metal then creates the new sword. And so I'm arguing that a similar procedure then occurs in the reader or the viewer's mind as they view the graphic novel. So from all these various shards of imagery, so to speak, the reader takes them into the crucible of the imagination, forges them into a single narrative, into a single narrative stream, and then has their narrative sword, so to speak. So in particular, I want to look at this kind of image set right here. Siegfried's working at the bellows, so not a very common image nowadays. You don't see many people working at bellows, so it takes a little bit of imaginative stretch for the reader, but it's relatively easy to follow. So first off, see the whole, he's pulling over the bellows, so you can see, again, this first establishing shot. You see it first then closed. And you see his arms up, you see his arms down, and then you see the bellows open. So, I mean, obviously, he's working at the bellows, you know he's making it move, but the actual signs that are given, it's amazing the amount of imagination that the reader or the viewer has to employ in able to put those all together into that relatively complex action sequence. So this was kind of a point of controversy again, as I've been continuing in the story. Obviously, with graphic novels, you're not going to be able to have the sound, the music that you're going to get in an opera. There's simply no way you can compensate for that. So instead, I tried to explore the effect that the music has on the viewer in perceiving the story, or in the way that they understand the story, and then seeing if there are any analogous functions then in the case of a graphic novel. So when I came up with that, there's something called a tempo rubato in music, or robbed time. So in which case, the composer or the performer will either take a certain moment and stretch it really out, or go really, really fast through a certain part, just playing with the tempo of the music in order to add certain expressive emphases as demanded by the storyline. And so this scene here, spoiler alert, sorry, Brunhilde dies. So this is the case of the scene at the very end of Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods, where Siegfried is dead, and so Brunhilde is joining him on the funeral pyre. And so what we see here then, so first off, you see her on her horse. Pretty big panel. The first two panels are actually pretty large. They draw a lot of attention to themselves. They draw a lot of time and weight also as a thing. So the larger panel is, the more time it takes to kind of make sense of it in your mind, and the more emphasis it receives. So from those two rather large establishing panels, Then we go to some smaller panels here. Again, she's on a horse. Then we just see Brunhilde. Then the horse's head, Siegfried on the flames and the boobs, and it gets smaller and smaller as you go towards the corner, until finally you come to the huge scene over there where she's actually jumping into the fire. And so from there, this in music then would be analogous, sense-wise, time-wise, to an orchestra going faster and faster and faster and faster until they finally reach the climatic point at the end there. That would be like the moment where there's a huge chord and in the whole orchestra, there's soprano singing the high C on the glass, the breaking and everything. And so that would be kind of that point then there from an orchestra sense. Also a point drawing from the musical structuring of graphic novels. Craig Russell is especially good in this case for describing framework and paneling as music. He often speaks of his paneling as rhythmic or lyrical, and he has a very strong music background then in his own history. So one part also is interesting. He spoke of his paneling as symphonic, which I thought was absolutely fascinating in relation to an orchestra, because with a symphonic orchestra you have a lot of different scenes or streams of time kind of going on at the same time. So you got the violins, you got the horns, you got percussion, and all these different streams of time happening at the very same time. So what you have here, though, with the graphic novel, you have a lot of different moments, per se, happening at the very same time. So with the film, you can go from one shot to the next, and have really no point of reference to the shot that came before it. But with the graphic novel, it's all right there on the page. So whenever you're composing, you have to be composing the time in relation to these other moments of time. So just having that kind of layered awareness of a number of other levels of time, and then also obviously you need to be aware of color, shape, different size blockings and things. Obviously the symphonic arrangement of that panel is very different from the symphonic arrangement of this panel here in terms of line color. And finally, there we go. So both opera and graphic novels have a sort of text-conscious, communicative display. So they're performative in that they're communicative presentations in which the active narration is itself on display. So obviously with any form of art or any form of presentation, the act of narrating and presenting itself is going to be on display. But I think it's especially apparent in the case of like the graphic novel or an opera. So when you're at the opera, it's very hard to forget that you're at the opera. People are on stage, and no matter how far you've run into the story, you're always conscious that the people on stage are there and they're sitting. So when you're reading a book, sometimes it's very easy to forget that you're reading a book and just to see the story in your mind. Graphic novels are similar, I think, to operas in this case, in that as much as you're drawn into the story, you never really forget that you're reading a graphic novel, because the textual element is so strong with the different forms of paneling, the different colors. It's always continually drawing attention to itself as a textual presentation. And so particularly in here, in a few moments where the textual element is extremely strong, it's very interesting. Russell uses a recurring symbol of some sort of circular imagery. I thought it was analogous to, I would say, a mandala, in which, in terms of the psychoanalytic theory, according to Jung, is the symbol of selfhood, is the symbol of wholeness of the self. And so it's interesting, in Russell's graphic novel, this occurs a lot at moments that are really significant in the character's development, like some sort of turn in their lives or establishing themselves as a character. So in the case of that first one there, that's when the evil dwarf Albrecht steals the gold that will make the ring. So this is the moment that sets everything in motion. And so it's really highlighting that particular moment. Here's where Siegfried's swording his sword, at the same time forging his own identity as a hero. This is where Siegmund discovers the sword, and by this can defeat his enemy and hopefully win his bride. And then that scene over there, when the Rhine maidens finally get the ring back and everything is brought full circle. So these are all very key points in the story's development. And so I would consider this similar to like an aria on stage, where the singer is presenting either a strong part of their own identity or has some sort of character revelation, has some sort of significant development in the plot that is worthy of being brought out as a single song. So I consider that especially significant in these cases here. So. Yeah, so here's just kind of a summarization once more of the different points so far. Still in the process of finishing it all up, but these are kind of the main points of essentializing around here. So imaginary space created through visual verbal language, active synthetic reading required by the viewer, framed or symphonic time, and text-conscious communicative display. In terms of where I'm hoping to go with this project somewhere in the future, I would like to continue to develop this research if I could. Cross your fingers, I'm submitting my application for Ohio State next week, and they have a program there in narrative theory that's the best in the country. There's a particular scholar there named David Herman who studies constructing story worlds, and that's very much what I'm focusing on here. I draw a lot from his research in my own studies and stuff, so I'm hoping that he will pick up on that in my writing sample, but that's another story altogether. But anyway, that's where I'm going to continue this work, possibly return to Germany, apply for, they have an interdisciplinary narrative center in Hamburg, and yeah, I guess we'll just kind of keep going with it and see where it goes. So thank you very much for your time.